and I have a very good idea of where the artwork was buried, and I can't get into why.
On March 18th, 1990, the most audacious art heist of all time took place at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Two men dressed as police officers were admitted into the building by security, claiming to be responding to a disturbance call.
In 81 minutes, 13 pieces of art were stolen. Among the portraits, stripped from their frames, were works by Vermeer, Degas, and Rembrandt. Estimated at $500 million, the heist has been categorized as the largest and most frustrating of all time. Theories of their whereabouts and those who perpetrated the crime are abundant.
In this podcast series, we will dig as deep as possible into the case, the theories, and the social and economic impact the greatest unsolved art heist of all time had on the community. This is Empty Frames. In today's new episode of Empty Frames, we speak with old friend Eric Ulis, and Eric catches us up on his hunt for the Gardner artwork via his angle. Lance, really interesting stuff. What'd you make of this conversation?
Well, the Gardner heist is the story that keeps on giving. It's the gift that keeps on giving, and just when we think that we have... with Jeff Kelly, he was the last guest that we had on. Just when we think that we have a piece of the story that is what we're going to grab onto and go from here with, then Eric will pop into the scene. Someone like Eric pops into the scene and says, hey, I'm not saying that I have anything definitive here, but I got some good leads on the angles that I've been pursuing. And he makes such a compelling argument for his theory. And what I really like about him that I'm amazed by is that he goes out and buys himself a couple $1,000 metal detector and goes into the wilderness of Maine, and he's swinging this thing around. And regardless of what he thinks he's found, we're going to wait till the ground is thawed out. So I'm fascinated by it. It keeps on producing.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. I can't wait to see what he finds, and you'll hear all about this in this conversation. And of course, Eric Ulis is hot on the trail of Brian McDevitt, who has been viewed and discussed and podcasted about and written about, documentaried about as being one
investigated.
As being one of the leading suspects in the heist for years. And Eric goes through the entire timeline here in this story, right up until what we're talking about now with his updates in his current search. So let us know what you think on YouTube or Spotify. Definitely check out Eric Ulis's site at ericulis.com. And we're going to break quick here for commercial, and we'll be right back with Eric Ulis. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Eric Ulis. Eric, how are you today?
I'm doing well, guys. How are you doing?
Always good when you join the show, because we know we're going to have a lot of really cool information about one of these mysteries that you've been covering for years. I feel like we're going to get some big D.B. Cooper bombshells here.
Not today. Nothing D.B. Cooper related, even though there's a lot of stuff going on in that space. I actually have said publicly recently that I think there's a pretty good chance before the end of this year, before the end of 2026, that I'll be able to basically name who the guy was. So there's a lot of stuff happening on that front. And what's cool about that is it's all science-based, I mean, it's just letting sort of science and the evidence kind of drive the investigation. But we'll see. That may be a little bit overly optimistic. Maybe we have to wait till January of 2027. But the larger point is I do believe it's getting close. So
yeah, I said that as a joke, and then you drop sort of a bombshell. So I appreciate the enthusiasm on that. Can you reintroduce yourself to the listeners, just to give them a refresher?
I'm one of these guys. I'm a private citizen, firstly. I'm not an FBI agent or former FBI agent or CIA or anything like that, even though some people may think, wait a minute, what's up with what's really going on with Eric here? But I'm honestly, I'm just some guy who loves these kind of mysteries, whether it's DB Cooper, the Gardner Museum heist, which we'll be talking about today, or certain other mysteries. I just love that kind of thing. And that's just sort of baked into my DNA from the very beginning. I came from the world of professional card counting blackjack. I've brought it up to people before. If you think of the movie 21 from many years ago, with Kevin Spacey and a group of guys that were from MIT, going to Vegas on, weekly trips, counting cards, crushing the casino and all that type of thing. That's the world I came from. I did that for a number of years. And while that seems like it would be wholly unrelated to investigating DB Cooper or the Gardner Museum heist or what have you, I actually think there's a significant correlation in terms of sort of how I approached, that lifestyle and that life, counting cards, blackjack, which is just pure math. That's absolutely objective. There's very little subjectivity, that type of thing. Sort of the mindset or the skill set, the takeaway from all my years in that world has really informed and shaped how I approach these cold cases. Again, I'm not one of these people that's prone to get into conspiracies and crazy stuff like that. I rather focus on the facts and the evidence as I understand it. Obviously, there's a fair amount of conjecture and all that that's sort of baked into it. There's no way around that. But to the degree that I can lean into facts, I think that that's the best way to approach these cases. So as far as the Gardner Museum heist is concerned, it's something that I've been interested in for a number of years. In particular, Brian McDevitt as a suspect in the Gardner Museum heist, and I'm continue to do a lot of work on that front. And I'm absolutely convinced that McDevitt was the guy, along with a friend of his named Steve Donahue. And I've felt this for a number of years. And this isn't just something I've pulled out of the ether. This is based upon a pretty serious investigation on my part. I've met basically everybody who knew Brian and have interviewed and talked extensively with these people, including his former girlfriend, Stephanie Rabinowitz, who's been on the show with me here and has been profiled in other podcasts discussing McDevitt. Importantly, she knew nothing of McDevitt's activities, true activities during that time, but she dated him starting, I guess about 6 or 7 or 8 months before the heist, and then through that whole period of time, and continued to have a relationship, be friends with him for a couple of years after that still. But Stephanie kept a detailed diary and journal, and which obviously, in retrospect, is critically important because it details what Brian was doing during that time, even the night of the heist, even that actual day. And so I think that's been really invaluable. So, I've gotten to know these people very well. I actually dated Stephanie, ironically, for the period of time after that, and we're very close friends to this day. But her diary is critically important. There are about 800 pages that cover that period of time, the McDevitt time frame. The FBI does not have the full 800 pages. They have excerpts. They have things that Stephanie sent to Jeff Kelly specifically, excerpts from the diary in 2004, that year 2004. And the reason I know that is because I actually have the facts. Stephanie saved the stuff, so I've seen all of this information. But aside from that, I've also got hundreds and hundreds of emails that Brian wrote during a couple year period of time leading up to his untimely passing. He died May 27th, 2004 from pneumonia. And at that time, he was living in Medellin, Colombia. He had been there for 11 years at that point. He fled the United States basically to avoid getting indicted and for the Gardner heist. So I've got a number of emails from Brian to a few different people, which largely tell the story of what happened. The FBI does not have this information, these emails. So, I mean, I'm working with information in many respects that the FBI doesn't have. But aside from that, I've also done a lot of boots on the ground research. I mean, I've actually talked with McDevitt's sister. I've met his brother briefly, and obviously talked with him briefly. And I've visited properties and things associated with the family. Let's just put it that way. So, I mean, there's a lot of boots on the ground investigation. And this here on my left here, this handy metal detector, pretty sophisticated piece of equipment, $2,000 metal detector, has played a significant role recently, as we'll probably talk about, in terms of identifying what I believe is where the artwork may well be.
I'm going to stop you real quick because I'm sure there are listeners who are like, okay, I got to gather my thoughts here. You've been on a few times, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Brian McDevitt. So if you don't mind giving a little background on who this individual is. But before, I'm sure there's a lot of people wondering, including Tim and I, how did you get your hands or eyeballs on these emails?
I got it through a source. I obtained them through a source, which is I'll just say it's a confidential source. So, but they're perfectly legitimate. So, I mean, I can't really go any further as far as that goes in terms of how I obtained them. But importantly, they include emails as well with the United States Embassy in Colombia. The U.S. Embassy is based in Bogota, Colombia, even though Brian was living in Medellin, Colombia. And that's an important thing because, and I'm sort of jumping ahead here, I do believe that the FBI on a couple of occasions actually had an opportunity to solve this case. And I'm not disparaging the FBI or what have you. To be sure, I think there are a few mistakes made, but that happens in every investigation, myself included. I've made plenty of mistakes, and I've had assumptions that are later, I did 180s, that kind of stuff. But in 2004 specifically, I think he was trying to cut a deal with the embassy that would have involved him supplying some information related to money laundering activities and all that kind of stuff. Taking place in the 2003 time frame related to the narco industry there, and it's important to remember this is also in the wake of September 11th. So there was a lot of work being done and trying to ascertain how Al Qaeda was being financed and how money was moving around and that kind of thing. So Brian certainly had some information with respect to how that all took place in Colombia. And he was trying to work out a deal, trying to provide some information. And I know this because I have the actual emails with the embassy, named people and everything else. So I know the details. I think at the time that this happened, that sparked some interest on the FBI's part into looking into McDevitt, or at least I suspect that. And the reason why I say that is that on two separate occasions, the FBI really started digging into McDevitt. Once was in 1992, a couple years after the heist. At that point, McDevitt's living in L.A. Stephanie, the former girlfriend's also living in L.A., even though they're not dating at that point. But the FBI interviewed Stephanie, the FBI interviewed Brian, FBI interviewed other people that Brian knew at that time in 92. Then fast forward to 2004, 12 years later, all of a sudden, there's interest again on the FBI's part in McDevitt. And Stephanie's living in Seattle at that point. And Jeff Kelly actually flew out to Seattle and interviewed Stephanie in Seattle about McDevitt. And it was at that point that she actually provided him that is Jeff Kelly, the agent in charge from the Boston office related to the Gardner heist that you had on recently. She provided him some excerpts from her diaries and that kind of stuff, which are really, really important. And I believe that or I suspect that what sort of sparked that interest on the FBI suddenly in 2004, 14 years after the heist, I imagine it had something to do with the fact that it was during that exact time, months earlier in 2003, when Brian was reaching out to the embassy in Colombia saying, hey, let's talk. And I know you guys know who I am and everything else. Unfortunately for them, before any kind of deal could be struck or consummated or whatever the case may happen to be, Brian died. Brian died again May 27th, 2004. So the one fax that Stephanie sent to Jeff Kelly that pertained to certain excerpts and information related to her diary was on May 5th, 2004. And I have the facts, so I know exactly what was sent and everything else. And it was 22 days later when Brian just died, from complications from AIDS, actually, pneumonia specifically. So I think that there was an opportunity that just sort of slipped through law enforcement's fingers. But as far as Brian goes, in 79, I think it was 1979, Brian kind of just crossed this Rubicon in his mind where he decided he was just going to sort of be a criminal. And this is a little remarkable because, he was a very bright guy. He was not an idiot. He was a very bright guy. Actually got my understanding is he got a full ride at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. So not a stupid individual to get into Bates. He's just a well-read, well-informed person. But he decided at that point, I think it was 78 or 79, that he was going to devise this really complicated scheme to gain access to a safety deposit box of an attorney in the Boston area and rip off the contents, which amounted to $150,000 of cash and bearer bonds and that kind of thing. And he did it. And Brian got away with it and was on the lam for a year and a half, something along those lines. But eventually the money starts to run out, and he ends up upstate New York, Saratoga Springs, presenting himself as a Vanderbilt, like literally one of the Vanderbilts, part of the family. He rented a Rolls Royce, and he's got a chauffeur named Giles driving him around. It was really crazy. Honestly, the story is crazy, but it's real. So he's there pretending to be somebody he's not. And it's during his time there that he sets his sights on a museum called the Hyde Museum, which is a mini Gardner Museum. It's exactly like the Gardner Museum, but it's a miniature version of it. Everything. The courtyard in the center, the whole thing. Some of the arts collected, artworks, pieces there, that type of thing. Very similar. So he devises a very complicated plan. He sort of strong-arms somebody to go in on robbing the museum with him. And they devise a plan that is strikingly similar, ultimately, to what happens 10 years later in the Gardner Museum. Unfortunately for Brian, they got caught before they had a chance to rip off the museum. And Brian was, charged and actually served a couple of years in prison related to it. And at the same time, once he got caught for the attempted Hyde Museum robbery, he also got busted for ripping off the safety deposit box. So Brian was in some hot water in the early 1980s. But he served this time and ultimately went to the University of Massachusetts and finished his college degree. He actually got his college degree. So kudos to the guy for, making a rebound as far as that's concerned. Either way, he's living in Boston. He meets Stephanie and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the Gardner Museum heist occurs, March 18, 1990. And immediately, the FBI is looking at Brian McDevitt as at least a person of interest, because the DNA of the heist is very similar to the attempted heist 10 years earlier. Plus, Brian's living in Boston and all that other kind of stuff. And that's where it all kind of starts getting involved in there. But for whatever reason, the FBI looked into Brian, and I don't know if they ever eliminated him or whatever happened with respect to their interest in Brian, but it clearly waned over the years, and the FBI and Anthony Amore became particularly enamored and convinced with this whole notion that organized crime was somehow involved with the heist up in with the Gardner Museum heist, which I just vehemently disagree with. So that's just kind of a quick overview synopsis of Brian and everything.
What happens when two true crime podcasts come together for one night only?
They talk about really dumb criminals, of course. Join us for Criminally Stupid, the search for the world's dumbest criminal. A live show with Crawlspace and another f***ing horror podcast.
For the first time ever, Tim Pilleri and... Did I get that right? I f***ed it up already. Great. I'm crushing this.
No, you got Pilleri right.
Amazing. Pilleri, thank you. Thank you. Amazing. For the first time ever, Tim Pilleri and Lance Reenstierna, the team behind such beloved podcasts as Missing and Crawlspace.
And Monique Sanchez and Amy Traden, the BFFs from the paranormal, true crime, comedy hit, Another Horror Podcast, are sharing a stage and bringing their A game to celebrate and humiliate the world's most criminally challenged.
Each host will take the mic to present their case, a true story of a criminal so spectacularly and breathtakingly stupid that it will prove that truth is indeed stranger than fiction.
Evidence will be presented, arguments will be made, and dignity will be lost.
Once our hosts have rested their cases, that's when the real fun begins. At the end of the night, you, the audience, will vote on who will be crowned the world's dumbest criminal.
It's part true crime, part comedy show, all laughs. Criminally Stupid is a night you won't want to miss.
Join us Saturday, April 25th at 9 p.m. at Shillelagh Tavern, 4722 30th Avenue, Astoria, New York City.
The show starts at 9 p.m., but the night doesn't stop there. Stick around and the party will keep going with karaoke at 11 p.m. Come for the crimes, stay for the singing. We're not judging. Well, actually we are. That's kind of the whole point.
This is a 21 and over event, and valid ID is required.
For tickets, follow the Eventbrite link in the notes or go to Eventbrite and search Criminally Stupid.
So you mentioned you read Jeff Kelly's book. So he doesn't mention McDevitt in the book. And I was a little surprised about that too, because there's a lot of people that he does mention, a lot of angles. The organized crime angle that he does write about most in the book involves Gentile Guarenti, this artwork down in, being moved down through Connecticut. So you don't think any of that happened? Do you think McDevitt is, obviously you think McDevitt is one of the thieves, but did he have any connection to those guys, or how do you work that out in your theory?
So first of all, with respect to the book, I did read Jeff's book and I thought it's a very good book. And I recommend anybody who's interested in this type of thing, buy the book and read it. It's a terrific book. And I mean, I just consumed it. It was released on March 10th, if I believe. And like, bing, I bought it. I went to Barnes & Noble up in, I think it was Bellingham, Mass. is where he got it. I think it was in Bellingham, and just snapped it up. But great read, great book. To answer your question, yeah, I think that they're wrong. The FBI and Anthony Amore are wrong about organized crimes. And I use the term organized crime kind of loosely. I understand that Jeff is not really talking about like the five families and all that kind of stuff. He's talking about sort of criminal elements that are kind of loosely organized. So I'll just use it as a generic term, organized crime, just for clarity here. But I do believe that I just don't think that they're involved. As to whether now, but having said that, I understand why the FBI would go down that path and would be interested. So, I mean, these guys aren't idiots. These are the guys that wear the white hats. I have no issue with the FBI or Anthony for that matter. But I think they're wrong. And I think to some degree they've kind of taken the bait that a lot of these bad guys are kind of, spinning out there, and because they're always angling. They're ever angling for, a way to con somebody out of this, that, or whatever. And I think that's a lot of what was going on. And I think the FBI just kind of bought it. But as far as whether Brian actually knew any of these people, like a George Reisfelder, for example, I don't know. I don't know that he does or that he ever knew any of these people, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. And the reason why I say that is because Brian was making a living somehow in the, let's say 1989 timeframe leading up into 1990. And I don't know how. He didn't have a job, but somehow he always had money. I mean, Stephanie relayed to me that they used to go out regularly to nice dinners, that kind of thing. Brian always paid for that. Brian had an apartment on Beacon Hill. He had, nice things in the apartment. Brian took Stephanie in December of 1989 on a vacation, a working vacation to Jamaica. They were there for a week. Brian paid for everything related to that. Brian ended up moving to LA 6 weeks after the heist, or he moved June 1st. So what is that? March, April, May, June, 10 weeks, I guess, 2.5 months after the heist. So Brian was making money somehow. I just haven't been able to put a finger on it. I've suspected that maybe he had some sort of drug dealings or money laundering drug dealings. I don't really know. But given he's in Boston area and it's a little uncertain with respect to how he's making his money, it is certainly possible that there was some sort of tangential relationship to those people there. I should say that Brian, in the email communication that I have, mentions that he met Whitey Bulger. He doesn't put any more meat on the bone with respect to that. Like, I don't know what the context was or what have you. And frankly, maybe Brian's full of shit because Brian was a prolific liar. I mean, there were things that he said that are demonstrably false, but that doesn't mean everything he said was false. And a lot of times he says things that is sort of, he kind of wants his cake and wants to eat it too with respect to his prospective involvement with the heist. And there's a cover your ass kind of mentality going on with Brian as well, especially after he's, fled the country and he's in Colombia and so forth. So it's, I know Brian extremely well at this point because I've read a lot of stuff that he's written. I know a lot of people that he knew, and Stephanie in particular, very well. So I know Brian's mind and the way he thinks, the way he operated very, very well. And so I can kind of see through him and I understand what's going on there. So I don't know. I mean, maybe he met Whitey Bulger, maybe he didn't. If he met Whitey, he certainly could have met somebody else, But the short answer to your question is I just don't know.
So when do you think that Brian concocted the plan or formulated the plan to perpetrate this heist on the Gardner Museum, and who did he involve in this? Because I'm guessing, based on our conversations, that he was one of the two, quote, police officers that rang the bell or approached the door the night of the heist. And did he have any connection to Rick Abbott or to Randy, who were the security guards that night?
There's a lot there. I believe that Brian, this idea was hatched. His partner, Steve Donahue, was the other guy. And they hatched this in Jamaica. Brian met Steve in 1988 in Jamaica. And then, of course, they had Brian and Stephanie traveled to Jamaica and met with Steve in December of 1989. And I've got photographs of them together with Steve and everything else. And I had long identified Steve as the other guy, the second guy. And it was later confirmed in Brian's emails. These emails that I'm referencing, I've had my hands on them for about a year, a little less than a year at this point. But Brian actually confirms in the emails that, yes, Steve was the guy. And remember, these emails were written 2003, 2004, that time frame. So that's a really important thing. It confirmed what I've long suspected. Yeah, so it was hatched at that point in Jamaica. Rick was involved. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind, and there hasn't been for years, that it was part of this inside thing. Now, I don't think Rick was like an intricate part of the plan, meaning he was one of the masterminds. I think he in some way got sort of strong-armed into it, not too unlike the guy who got strong-armed into the attempting the Hyde Museum heist 10 years earlier by Brian. What I do know about Rick is Rick lived in Allston, the Allston part of Boston. And literally, this isn't hyperbole, literally 1,000 feet away is where Stephanie lived. That's where Stephanie's apartment was. Remember, Brian lived on Beacon Hill. And in between Stephanie and Rick's houses was a club called Harper's Ferry, a musicians club, music club, whatever. Anybody who lived around Boston's probably familiar with Harper's Ferry, which is no longer around, but it was like the center of the music scene there. So clearly, I'm sure Rick was at Harper's Ferry on a handful of occasions, but Stephanie certainly was there on a handful of occasions with Brian, and the reason I know that is because she wrote about it in her diary. Interestingly, as the date of the heist approached, I noticed that Brian started spending more time with Stephanie in the Allston area. And Stephanie told me that Brian would take off and go visit with a friend. She didn't know who this was or anything, didn't really inquire him, but then he would come back a few hours later, whatever the case may happen to be. Previous to this, most of the time was spent at Brian's place on Beacon Hill. They would do stuff downtown Boston or whatever. So that certainly isn't a smoking gun by any means in terms of, there's a connection between Brian and Rick, but it's certainly intriguing. So I suspect that Brian somehow was looking into the personnel at the museum, or maybe he just happened to come across Rick somehow at Harper's Ferry. I don't know, but I suspect that that's, Brian and Rick had a relationship, meaning, I think they knew each other, related to this specifically, and that Rick was the inside man as far as that's concerned. Again, it's important to understand that I don't have a smoking gun. I can't point to I don't have a photograph of the two of them together, anything of this nature. This is just a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence and stuff that I think just ties these guys together. And I think it's really, really important. But I'm absolutely convinced. And I think Jeff Kelly's book makes the case beyond a shadow of a doubt that Rick was the inside guy.
Yeah, I agree there. For sure that Abbott, would have had to have been the inside guy. What I will say is, though, that the book sort of lays out the Carmelo Merlino angle from that gang in that auto body shop. That area, all very close that we're talking about, all very close. So could McDevitt have even known those guys? That there could have been some crossover as far as we know.
It's possible. It's possible. I just don't know the answer to that question. I've never been able to prove anything one way or the other. I will say this, though, and this is the biggest flaw with the FBI and Anthony Amore's theory about this. The biggest problem with their theory is, why the hell hasn't anybody availed themselves of the $10 million or the immunity or the get out of jail free card aspect? Like, you can't explain that. I mean, there's no honor among thieves when you're talking about these guys here. And if we're to believe the FBI's narrative, the art was kind of split up among different people, and the finials ending up in, some jewelry store, and then the Chez Tortoni's hanging on somebody's wall, and the other couple pieces are in Maine in the trunk of a car, then end up in Connecticut, then end up in Philadelphia. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of shit going on there among a hell of a lot of bad guys, none of whom are to be trusted. And you can't tell me wouldn't think twice about stabbing somebody in the back if they were going to capitalize in some manner off of it. Yet after all of that apparent activity and all of this time, 36 years, not a single person has claimed one red penny of the $10 million of reward money, has provided any kind of material evidence or proof of anything from what I can tell. No one's used it as a leverage to get out of jail free card. Morlino, you brought up Morlino. This guy died in prison. You're trying to tell me that Morlino knew stuff about this, was designed the plan or what have you, and literally just decided, fuck it, I'm going to die in prison and take this to the grave? Does that make any sense to anybody there? Plus the offer of immunity that's been out there.
He may not have known where the artwork was by the time he was in prison. Also, people got killed. There's 3 or 4 murders in regards to this.
Sure.
But what I will say is at the end of that conversation that we had with Jeff Kelly, we asked him about the other pieces of artwork that he does not mention in the book, which is most of the artwork. They have no leads on those. So I don't know. I do think that angle with Reisfelder, Donati, I think to me that's solid angle. But I'm not saying that McDevitt couldn't have had some opportunity here, either moving it or stealing the artwork. Something in there, though. I mean, it's a small neighborhood, and he's a con man, and these guys are, criminals too.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and it's certainly possible that there's somebody knew somebody in some other manner. By the way, Brian is the only person to have ever confessed to the heist. No one else has ever confessed to the heist. There are people that say they've seen it or have access to the artwork, but the only person who's ever confessed is Brian McDevitt. And he didn't confess publicly. He confessed privately to, I know of at least 2 people, one of whom was Stephanie, his girlfriend. So that for what it's worth, take that there. But again, the problem with that whole organized crime thing is that there's just nothing has ever come of it, and I can't explain it. I don't think Jeff Kelly or Anthony Amore can explain why it is that nobody has no verifiable information has come out with respect to one shred of this artwork. Therefore entitling somebody to a piece of the $10 million reward, or availing himself of the immunity, or getting out of jail free. Like I said, I mean, Merlino died in prison. Gentile, they thought he was going to die in prison and didn't give it up. He didn't give up anything. And Gentile said famously to his attorney, Ryan McGuigan, but there ain't no paintings. When McGuigan said, dude, if you just give me some information with respect to this, like, you can go home and die in bed with your wife tonight. I guarantee it. And he just said, there ain't no paintings. And he said he got caught up in his own con, basically. And I think that that's exactly what's happened here. A critical thing here with respect to McDevitt, and specifically the statute of limitations. And this kind of like makes the hair on the back of my neck, kind of spike up every time I hear the FBI and others talk about the statute of limitations. It long since expired. Therefore they had no leverage over these guys, blah, 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 blah. They're absolutely right. If it comes to organized crime and those guys, that's exactly right. Though the statute of limitations expired and there's not a damn thing anybody can do about it. Maybe you can nail somebody for possession, but that no longer became an issue when they basically said, listen, we're not interested in prosecuting anybody. We'll grant immunity. Plus, you can still capitalize off the $10 million. When it comes to McDevitt, the statute of limitations does not apply. And the reason why the statute of limitations does not apply, and this was constantly on Brian McDevitt's mind because he speaks to this, is because Brian was pulled in front of a federal grand jury in Boston and then fled the country shortly thereafter in October of 1993. So when Brian left the country in October 1993, basically 3.5 years after the heist, and never came back, that stops the clock on the statute of limitations. So the clock stops. So there's still 18 months, 1.5 years, 17 months, something of that nature of time left on the statute of limitations clock once Brian left. So theoretically, if Brian was still alive today, living in Colombia, and decided to come back to the United States, the clock starts ticking again, and Brian could literally be charged today, 36 years later, for stealing the artwork, for possessing the artwork, and for perjury in front of the grand jury. It's critical to understand that. So that's why, in part, Brian never tried to take advantage of any of this stuff because none of it was in place. No statute of limitations. He couldn't avail himself of any of the reward money. There's no immunity deal or anything of that nature, when he died, in 2004. And by the way, his partner Steve was killed in Jamaica in 1993. So he was killed a couple years after the heist.
That part makes me feel a little silly because it's something that I've said numerous times, like, oh, the statute of limitations is up. And I just never realized that it wasn't up for any individual who had left the country, that it stops the clock on that. So super interesting part right there. You just mentioned his partner, Steve. And earlier on, you said that he confirms that Steve was his partner during the Gardner heist in the emails. What is his confession like in the emails? Does he say Steve Donahue joined me in robbing the Gardner Museum? Was it that direct in the emails?
No, he talks about who his partner was. He talks about who his partner was with it. And he actually doesn't use his last name, doesn't use his proper last name. He uses another name, but not his real last name in the email. But it's Steve, and we know it's Steve because he mentions Steve. And there are certain details that he provides there. There is a lot of really interesting stuff related to Steve. Steve was a former stockbroker for Drexel Burnham Lambert. Is that how you pronounce it? The old Michael Milken, shady stuff going on in the 80s, Wall Street stuff. So Steve came from that world. He literally worked for the company. So then he, quit the company, went to Jamaica, and basically that's where Brian met Steve. And these guys were up to no good. I mean, these guys were really up to no good. They were up to some shenanigans. And I don't know if Steve learned this stuff working for Milken back in the day, Drexel Burnham and all that kind of stuff. But pretty sophisticated, pretty sharp guy as far as that's concerned. Couple of interesting details that Brian reveals related to the heist. He says that the heist, and again, he writes about this in 2003, he says that the heist was actually planned originally for St. Patrick's Day, for the 17th. It took place on the 18th. Now, I've heard it said a number of times it was, basically the 17th because it was the early morning hours of the 18th, and that the reason he planned it for that day is because the cops would have their hands tied with all the revelry going on and everything in Boston during St. Patrick's Day. But that wasn't it. Brian says that the reason it was planned for St. Patrick's Day is because the dude's Irish. Brian's Irish. And that's sort of, that's the reason that date was chosen in part, but it was planned for the 17th. Now, Brian doesn't explain what went wrong, why it couldn't take place on the 17th and why it ended up being pushed back 24 hours. Remember, this is written in 2003. It's not till years later when the FBI releases that videotape from the day before, 24 hours earlier, and they're trying to identify who this mysterious person is that was let in by Rick Abbott and all this other kind of stuff. It wasn't until years later when we see that tape and we realize that the supervisor's there, and it was basically like Grand Central Station 24 hours earlier there. So obviously, that's why the heist couldn't take place on the 17th, because it just happened to be a beehive of activity 24 hours earlier. So that's why ultimately it was pushed back 24 hours later. Brian also speaks to the fact that his favorite movie is Lawrence of Arabia, and I've known this for a long time. And it's a terrific movie. I've watched the movie. He says that actually played a part in some of the stuff that was stolen. Like that sort of was part of because some of the items were personal grabs, like the finial was a personal grab. Attempting to take the Napoleonic flag was a personal grab. The Degas, the horse sketches, personal grab. That is all related to Brian's interest in the Lawrence of Arabia movie, because Brian was very much into Hollywood, wanted to be a screenwriter, told everybody he was, all that kind of stuff. That's why the finial was taken and why he attempted to take the Napoleonic flag, is because the standards and the flags and stuff are prominently featured in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. If you see him on the horses and all that kind of shit. And of course, remember, he spent time in Saratoga with the horses and everything, and that's where the Degas stuff is. So he says that's where that personal grab stuff, that's why that stuff was taken, because it was again the kind of the personal nature of it there. But so there's a handful of intriguing and interesting things that he brings out there that in retrospect I'm reading this stuff, and again, I understand Brian's a prolific liar and all that kind of stuff. It's either one gigantic, huge mind fuck that's really next level, or the guy was involved. And like I said, there are certain details and things there that he couldn't really have known. For example, why they didn't happen on the 17th and those kind of things without some sort of inside information there.
Can you tell us a little bit more about these emails? So you mentioned that Brian would have been, or if he'd come back into the States, potentially on the hook for crimes again. And you have emails with, what was it, the American embassy or the consulate?
The U.S. embassy in Colombia, which is in Bogota, or at least it was in Bogota in 2003. I don't know if that's changed or not since then, but yeah.
So I guess, can you provide us some insight on what those emails say? And I know you may have to be somewhat vague, but I guess I'm curious about the confession, and was he trying to come back to the States? Help me connect these dots.
Yeah. I want to say that some of this is conjecture on my part, because he never says, I'm willing to give you the location of the Gardner artwork. You give me a witness protection deal and give me immunity. He never says anything like that. What he says is a little more sort of a tongue-in-the-cheek kind of thing. I've got information related to a bunch of, high-powered people in Colombia related to money laundering and fake accounts and all that kind of stuff, investments and the padding of investments and all that kind of stuff, kind of that illustrate how money is laundered in that world. And again, I think it's important to remember that this is in the wake of September 11th. And he offers it up to them. He's like, I want to communicate this stuff, and he does mention some names and some details, but he doesn't get into all of the specific accounts and specific things there. But he basically is opening a channel with the embassy, saying, "I've got this information. You should listen to what I have to say as far as this goes here." And I know with his sort of tangentially related email communication, that he basically couches that it's an opportunity to sort of do the right thing by his country, but it's also the opportunity where he realizes he may be able to get something out of it. And it's hard to really kind of get into all the details, like what precipitated this, but basically he felt like he had been wronged by the bad guys that he was working with there. And Brian says that his grandfather, a person he emulated, his grandfather always had his grandfather's attitude was, don't get mad, get even. And Brian says, that's exactly how I am. I don't get mad, I get even. You fuck with me, I'll fuck with you. And that's exactly what kind of precipitated this outreach, this whole thing after 11 years of being in Colombia. Brian was getting frustrated. He didn't feel like the embassy was sort of taking him seriously enough, and they were kind of giving him a little bit of the runaround. But they did put him in contact with the CIA guy, the head of the CIA station there, what have you. And I'm probably not saying it properly. There may be some other term or whatever the deal is. But this was all unfolding during this late 2003 going into 2004 timeframe. Again, very coincidentally, that's exactly when all of a sudden Jeff Kelly is reaching out to Stephanie and flying out to Seattle and interviewing her and all this other kind of stuff. And then again, May of 2004, Brian dies, and it's game over effectively for all that. So I don't know if that's all related, but it sure is. It'd be interesting to ask Jeff. And the other thing, this is and I'm kind of going back to like the fact that there's not a lick of McDevitt mentioned in Kelly's book. The other thing I would love to ask Jeff is the reason why nothing was mentioned in your book about Brian, is that because maybe the powers that be at the FBI who have to approve everything pulled it? I mean, was he originally part of the book and they just said, we don't want you to include anything related to McDevitt? Like, it's something I think about. I'm like, I don't know, it's kind of interesting because it seems like a glaring omission. I mean, this guy was a serious suspect, for a number of years. I mean, featured on 60 Minutes and featured on Inside Edition, written about, by the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the LA Times. I mean, how do you write the book on the Gardner Museum heist and there's no mention at all of McDevitt? That just seems really strange to me. And maybe Jeff can't say, and that's fine. Jeff strikes me as a totally good guy, cool guy. I'd love to have a beer with him, to be honest with you. But it just, I'm just curious, because to me that just seems like, what's going on there? Why is he not there in the book? But yeah.
So tell us about your hunt for this artwork today. What is happening? You mentioned the metal detector. You mentioned the property. What is going on right now? Where is your hunt taking you?
Yeah, I'm going to be very careful and very vague about a lot of stuff here. I believe that what happened that night is that, and I can't get into all the details of exactly why I believe this, but this is essentially what I believe happened. On the night of the heist, when they finally left the museum, they drove up to Maine. And the family has a camp in Maine, has a cabin up in Maine, and I believe that the artwork originally ended up at the family camp. Now, the family camp was something that was utilized during the summer months, but it was vacant during the winter months, basically, during that time. Ultimately, the father ended up living there and all that kind of stuff. But previous to that, it was basically just vacant, was kind of mothballed during the winter months. And that would have been the case in March of 1990. So I believe that the artwork ended up there. Brian does mention in the emails that the reason for the theft, what they were trying to do was defraud the insurance company. They were trying to defraud. The whole idea was, let's rip off the artwork. Steve was going to orchestrate this from Jamaica, the whole finder's fee with the insurance company thing and all that good stuff. But 2 days later, and Brian writes about this, 2 days later, they learned, there is no insurance. The stuff wasn't insured. And that created a major problem for them, as you can imagine. There ain't no money to be had. So basically, the artwork was stayed up at the camp for a few months, and they weren't really sure how to play that hand at that point. You know what I'm saying? And obviously the authorities are looking into all kinds of things, including Brian. So I believe that they realized come by October of 1990 that they had to do something with the artwork. They couldn't leave it in the camp forever because, while it was apparently hidden well enough where, for a season or two, no one may discover it or see it or whatever, eventually somebody's going to find it as they're looking around or whatever the case may happen to be. Brian traveled to Jamaica in October, very early October of 1990. The reason I know this is because Stephanie wrote about it. Her diary is brilliant in terms of filling in details and things of that nature. So Brian travels to Jamaica, and I believe it's at that time. I don't have anything concrete to prove this. This is just what, supposition on my part here, that Steve and Brian discussed, what are we going to do? Obviously there's no insurance, we can't take advantage of the reward. We got authorities breathing down all over the place. What's the plan? And I believe that what they decided to do was to remove the artwork from the camp and bury it somewhere. And I have a very good idea of where the artwork was buried, and I can't get into why, but I'll just say I've got a pretty good idea of where the artwork was buried. It's not buried at the camp. I'll just say that, okay? It's not buried at the camp. And I've been to the camp, so I know the location hasn't been really publicly disclosed or anything, but I know where it is. I've been there, so, So basically, I believe that Steve and Brian and Steve left Jamaica and then traveled up to Maine. Now, Brian and I believe they traveled through Boston, and I know from Stephanie's diaries that Brian was indeed in Boston, like I think it was the 10th of October. I think it was the exact date. I know that Brian was in Boston during that time. Now, remember, Brian's living in LA at this point, so he's really traveled out to Boston, Jamaica, and then Boston. I know that because, again, Stephanie wrote about it. And I believe it was at that time that two of them, Brian and Steve, traveled to Maine and buried the artwork. I don't believe they destroyed it. Now, initially, when I talked about this on one of your early podcasts a couple years ago, I believe that the artwork was burned, had likely been burned in LA, but I've completely changed my mind with respect to that because new information and new data has come to light. And I'm like, okay, I don't think that's the case at all. I think it actually ended up in Maine after all. I do not believe they destroyed the artwork. And the reason they wouldn't have destroyed the artwork is because even though they can't maybe avail themselves of $10 million or $5 million, whatever the reward was back then, I think that they realized it's the one ace in the hole if they happen to get busted. If they happen to get busted, then they could say, well, let's cut some kind of a deal. We'll cough up the artwork for a lesser sentence or whatever have you. If you destroy the artwork and then you get caught, you have nothing, you have no leverage. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's what happened. And I believe all 13 pieces stayed together. I do not believe it was shifting all over the place. I think all 13 pieces shifted together, or stayed together rather. And I have traveled to the area that I believe that the artwork is located. And I have actually pinged with this guy here a spot that may actually be the location of the artwork. Now, again, I said that I believe the artwork is buried, and I believe it's buried in Maine. And anybody who's been up in Maine in the middle of winter knows that the ground is frozen. So it's not as simple as, well, taking this heavy duty shovel here and, digging into the ground and unearthing it. It's more a matter of waiting for the ground to thaw and everything else for that to happen. But I've identified a very intriguing spot with respect to this that, may or may not be the location of the artwork, but there's enough anomalous activity there where it, at a minimum, is very intriguing and is exactly where I would expect it to be based upon stuff that I can't talk about right now. So there we go. So that's what's taking place right now as we speak. Very active. And hopefully there's some resolution to be had with respect to this. So I don't plan on involving the FBI or anybody of that nature into it. Obviously, if I get to the location and it becomes apparent that, this is the artwork or a piece of it or whatever, or a police badge buried in the Boston police officer's badge, or box cutters or something that would have been used. Obviously, at that point, everything will just stop, and at that point, I would get the authorities involved, the FBI, because I don't want to ruin anything, of course, until I have an opportunity to kind of see what I'm actually dealing with there. I'm just going to keep it on the down low as far as that goes. So,
how far down you think the stuff is?
I think the stuff, because I have managed to scratch through the surface a couple of inches, and I'm already hitting something. So it would be just a couple of inches below the surface. At least the top of the stuff would be a couple of inches below the surface. I want to be very clear about this. I'm not saying I've found the artwork. I don't know. It's really hard to tell what I'm dealing with because the ground is like frozen a couple inches down. But I do know that, there again, it's the metal detectors pulling up kind of a combination of ferrous, non-ferrous material. Obviously, the Chinese coup and the finial are bronze, and bronze is non-ferrous because that's tin and copper. But the other things, like, for example, the police officer's badge or the box cutters, or if there are handcuffs or are there any kind of nails used to fashion a box or anything like that, that stuff is ferrous, has got iron in it, and that would ping up. So it's a little hard to know exactly what I'm dealing with. But just by virtue of the fact that I'm dealing with anything there, given the remote nature of the location, it's intriguing. Plus a few other things that are kind of in the mix there. So, but having said all that, I want to be very clear. I don't know. I don't know, and I don't want to like act as if I found it or whatever, because I just don't know. But I'll know very shortly. I'll know very shortly. The ground and everything is going to be thawed out there basically by the near the end of April. We'll be in a good enough spot where it should be able to know definitively what we're dealing with there.
Yeah, and also just be aware, like, that's also a good time where bears, I think, wake up from hibernation and are pretty hungry. So I don't know where in Maine you're at, but I'm pretty sure there are bears up there. So just be careful when you're out there in the wilderness.
That's a good point. So don't be like hauling in steaks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They love stolen art, actually. If you feed them finials or any Rembrandt, they love that.
They're ravenous for Rembrandt.
I'm a pescatarian. I don't eat meat other than seafood. But having said that, I think bears also like people. So, like I may be pretty tasty too, So yeah, it's a good point there. Lance, I need to keep that in mind that, there is wildlife in that area there. And, that's something that's actually a serious consideration. So,
it really is. Yeah.
You may just save my life.
Just keep downwind from them.
Yes.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining us here again on the show. We really appreciate it, and we love hearing about your chases for these artifacts, whether it's this case or DB Cooper or others. So definitely thanks so much for joining us, and keep us updated on this angle.
I will do that. I enjoy being on the podcast and listening to your podcast episodes, and certainly if anybody here hasn't taken the time to listen to your interview with Jeff Kelly, I strongly recommend it. Jeff strikes me as a good guy. I've never met him, never talked to him. He strikes me as a good guy, and his book is really terrific. So it's a hell of a read. And for those of us who are into like the serious parts of the case and the evidence and all that kind of stuff, there are some real gems in there that you just can't get anywhere else other than from the guy who was like heading the investigation for 22 years. So well worth the read. But yeah, thanks again, guys. I appreciate it very much. And I'll definitely keep you in the loop with what happens.